You know, there's always just really been something about a giant robot that does it for me. I don't know if it's the sense of scale or just the idea of it, or if I'm just real easily entertained. But whatever the case may be, I think it really makes sense that Pacific Rim ended up being one of my favorite movies of all time. What's up, gamers? The release of the new Pacific Rim anime on Netflix has got me feeling particularly nostalgic for one of my favorite movies of all time. For those of you who haven't seen it, I'm talking about the 2013 sci-fi action movie directed by Guillermo del Toro that's about a giant invagination that opens up in the bottom of the ocean floor, and a bunch of monsters keep coming through. These monsters can't be killed with missiles, so they gotta use giant robots that kill them with missiles. Also, the pilots of the robots have to relive one another's childhood trauma the entire time that they're working together. Also, the endgame of humanity in this movie is to throw a giant bomb at the monster portal because bombs have never worked before, but we're gonna try and use one on it again. The climax of the movie features a literally nameless antagonist getting vaporized by an exploding robot, followed by the most tense will they won't they moment in cinematic history. And spoiler alert, they won't. What I'm getting at here is that Pacific Rim is kind of a dumb movie. It has very little substance, it contradicts itself all the time, and I'm pretty sure it just exists as a vessel for cool CGI fights. So why on earth did this become my comfort movie? Why has this movie been the soundtrack to some of the most important moments in my life for the last 8 years? So join me on this journey as I take you through some of the deeply ingrained nostalgia that has led to my connection with this film. This is why I have seen Pacific Rim 50 times. The story begins one sweet summer's eve in 2013. My parents took me to the theater because they wanted to see The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, and me being an angsty teenager, I didn't want to be seen in the same place as them in public, so I split off and I watched Pacific Rim. I didn't really know what I was getting into, but one thing was very clear to me when that movie finished, and that is that this is the closest to good live-action mecha I think that we are ever going to get. So for context here, what am I talking about when I say mecha? Mecha is a genre of anime that goes back as far as anyone can remember, and it's all about giant robots who do cool giant robot stuff, which is cool and epic. Typically you'll see them flying around and destroying other giant robots, and occasionally there's even time to slip in a bit of deeper symbolism or political discourse. Mecha's a beautiful thing. It spawned beautiful moments, iconic moments, and really stupid moments as well. And its lasting legacy can be seen in the form of spin-off shows, merchandise, and giant robots that stand in Japan right now. All that being said though, live action anime adaptations can be really hit or miss. And I'm really glad that Pacific Rim turned out to be what it was, because I think Del Toro took the source material and he did something really beautiful with it. You could debate about whether this was plagiarism or an homage to the source material on Del Toro's part, but I think the bottom line is that he brought the genre into live action onto the silver screen in a really cool way that I think a lot of people can get behind because it's really palatable. Not to mention that the actual robots that we got to see on screen looked amazing, and I attribute that to two factors: wet and heavy. Let's talk about wet. All the big key scenes where these robots are doing a lot of action are either set in the water or in the rain. This has the exact same effect as those commercials you've seen where a can of Coke is covered in little droplets and it's absolutely glistening in the light. The robots look delicious. Now heavy. Industrial Lights and Magic did the special effects for this movie, and they did an incredible job rigging them to make them look like they are really subject to the forces of physics. They're big, they're slow, they're heavy. Every step feels like a ton of labor. Their foot comes down like an earthquake. When they land a punch, it's like a bomb going off. They are so hefty, and I love it. So really what I'm trying to get at is this movie is wet, heavy, and inspired by anime, and if that isn't the makings of the best movie of all time, then I don't know what is. So here's an interesting thought. Is Pacific Rim a feminist allegory? No, not even remotely. In fact, it doesn't even pass the Bechdel test. So in case you've never heard of that, it's a measure of diversity, and it asks if any particular piece of media has two named women who talk to each other about anything other than a man. Those criteria don't seem that hard to pass, right? Well, Pacific Rim fails, like most movies. And like many things in the early 2010s, it was getting blasted on Tumblr, until a user called SpiderZan contributed to the conversation. SpiderZan wrote about Mako Mori, one of the pilots in Pacific Rim. SpiderZan identified as an East Asian woman, and she wrote that Mako was a well-written Japanese woman who was informed by her culture without being solely defined by it, without being a racial stereotype, and getting to carry the movie and have character development. She felt like despite not passing the Bechdel test, those aspects of the movie felt like a win. In response to this, another user called Chayla chimed in and proposed a new test, a new measure of diversity called the Mako Mori test. In order for something to pass the Mako Mori test, it needs to have at least one female character who gets her own narrative arc, and it does not support a man's story. In the case of Pacific Rim, we got Mako Mori, whose arc was about her wanting to become a pilot. So that doesn't make Pacific Rim a feminist movie, but I think it's really cool that Pacific Rim of all movies would be the one to spur discourse about how we measure diversity in film. So obviously I've spoken to the robots in this movie quite a bit now, but Pacific Rim wouldn't be Pacific Rim if it weren't for the counterpart to those robots, and that would be the monsters. The movie calls them kaiju, literally after the genre of giant monsters in Japanese movies. ILM did an incredible job making their flesh look so realistic, and each one of their personalities and designs is unique and fascinating. I was doing a bit of research to find out who exactly designed them, and then I stumbled upon something very interesting about Pacific Rim that I didn't know before. Or rather, I should say, someone very interesting. One of the names cited as a creature designer for Pacific Rim was Mr. Wayne Barlow. Wayne Barlow's work is incredible, and his portfolio includes the likes of Pacific Rim, Avatar, and even Harry Potter. He's a designer, he's an illustrator, and his work has influenced many people. In my research, I stumbled upon the work of another Mr. C.M. Kozeman, someone who claims to have been strongly influenced by the work of Wayne Barlow. Kozeman created an entire ecosystem that he calls Snyad, an alien world that he populated with hundreds of different species that he drew, and not only drew, but drew to follow specific evolutionary lines that he imagined for that planet, with different features that show how he thinks life could have adapted to environment in a different world if life had started in a different way than it had on Earth. I have spent hours and hours looking at Kozeman's work and reading everything that he's written about Snyad. Truly an incredible project, and I think it shows just how powerful Barlow's influence can be. But I kept going through Barlow's work, and I came upon one thing that shook me to my core the second I saw it, and that was the fact that he wrote a book called The Expedition. Now bear with me here, but The Expedition is the source material for an hour-long Discovery Channel special about what life could be like on an alien planet. Barlow also did the concept art for that film adaptation of his book. Why is that so important to me? Well, I felt like I unlocked a core memory when I saw that. I distinctly remember being a tiny child plonked down in front of the Discovery Channel on a Saturday morning, watching some rerun of Alien Planet, and absolutely taking everything in. For an hour, I was fully immersed, transported to this alien world, and fascinated by the creatures that Barlow had designed to live there. Part of me wants to believe that Barlow's art style is so good that at that young age it imprinted upon me, and I would go on to recognize it subconsciously in other works that he created later on, like Pacific Rim. But I think realistically he might just be one of the best alien designers alive, and it's hard not to appreciate his work. So have I seen Pacific Rim an unreasonable number of times? Probably yes. It might be time for me to move on, but I've yet to find a replacement. I think ultimately this is a movie that used the best source material and used some of the best designers to create one of the best movies for me. It really scratched the itch in my brain to see some giant robots fight some giant monsters in the most tasteful way possible. So Pacific Rim, thanks for always being there for me. Don't ever change.